Courtney Becker-Foster. Several months ago, we started thinking about ecology and creation as it relates to our work as a church here. And one of the things that we identified as wanting to know more about was our watershed. So tonight's presentation builds on the work that Michael started for us about a month ago with the natural history of our watershed. And then tonight we get to learn about some stories of hope and new possibilities from our watershed. Rachel, I'll let her introduce herself as she likes, but as I understand it, is a field biologist with the National Park Service, and we are delighted to have her with us tonight. So please join me welcoming Rachel, and then we'll let her have it, and then questions and answers after.
Thank you so much, Brian. Yeah, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor, and I love sharing about this work with people who actually live here. I feel like a lot of my talks I give at conferences, and there's a lot of graphs and statistics, and I'm happy to report that tonight there will be no p-values, there will be no graphs on display, and there will only be just beautiful pictures, hopefully. And I hope to really tell this as a story, and I hope just kind of spark some new ideas for you all, and I hope that you walk away having learned maybe one or two new things. And so first of all, like Brian said, I'm a biologist with the National Park Service. I recently started a job as a plant biologist in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. So I live in Three Rivers on unceded western Mono land now, and I moved there recently. I'm still finishing up grad school at Cal Poly, and for my grad school project, I work in the Alpine in Yosemite, studying the impacts of climate change on alpine plants. And so when Brian first reached out to me to talk, the prompt was like, talk about ecological issues in our watershed. And I was like, that's a pretty broad prompt. Like, how do we hone that down? And so I just thought I'd share about salmon and the San Joaquin River, because that's a project I used to help out with. And having lived here in Fresno, I didn't even know there were salmon near Fresno when I first moved here. And I bet maybe some of you vaguely know there's a river, you've probably been down there a few times, and maybe you don't even know much about the salmon. So that's what I'm going to share about tonight. And a little disclaimer, I'm here just representing myself, not any agencies I currently work for or have in the past. So going rogue here. So let me grab my clicker. So we're first gonna kind of zoom out, and I really appreciated, I got to watch Michael's talk, the recording of it, and I'm hoping to kind of build upon that. There'll be some overlap, so if you missed Michael's talk, hopefully you'll walk away knowing what a watershed is as well. So there'll be some overlap. And so we're zooming out to a view of the world, but instead of showing kind of our arbitrary geopolitical boundaries, this is a map of the watersheds of the world. So each of those different colors represents an area of land where any water that drops on it flows out at a common point. So these are kind of nature's boundaries, are what this watershed map shows. And I like to start kind of these environmental conversations in church context with a reframing of scripture and tying that together. I think one of the most quoted or famous scriptures that we kind of laxly throw out there is John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son." And when we hear that scripture and we hear the word world, but we really interpret that as, for God so loved humans, and probably like, for God so loved humans that look like me and I get along with. You know, that's our vision of what that word world means in that context. But actually in Greek, that word is cosmos. So like the whole cosmos, all of creation, everything, not just humans. And so if we zoom in, here's just North America, the watersheds of North America. And then here's our arbitrary state of California. You know, there's the cutout boundaries that were drawn in the 1800s. but there's the more natural watersheds within. So in that kind of light blue, the big blob in the middle of the state, that's Sacramento and San Joaquin River watersheds kind of combined. They both, that whole area of land, all the water flows out into the Delta and the San Francisco Bay. And then to the south of that, that bright verdant green, that's technically the basin we're in now is the Tulare Lake and Buena Vista Lake watershed. And like Michael talked about last month, in really wet years, those basins merge together and the Kings River and the Kauai rivers overflow into the San Joaquin River watershed. And so zooming, another kind of, I like artistic renditions to help us visualize. This is an artist's rendition of what a watershed is. So from headwaters out to the outlet, watersheds can be thought as basins of relations. This is the SS Watershed Lifeboat. And all this land, the cities, the farms, the forests, the mountains are connected in this watershed. And in the lectionary reading last weekend, the scripture was about, Jesus was kind of getting tested and asked, like, what's the most important commandment? They're trying to, like, get him. And he replies that first, you need to love God, and second, you need to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think similarly with this scripture, we need to kind of reimagine or have a bigger imagination of who our neighbor is. In a lot of indigenous traditions throughout the world, plants and animals are not seen as objects, but are seen as kin or relatives. And it's more of this kind of newer concept that we think of humans as separate from nature, humans as above nature and having dominion over nature, but many cultures throughout the world view humans as part of nature, and that that we're all part of one system within our watershed. So I want us to kind of slow down and think about that, like, what does that really mean in our bodies right now? So all together, let's all just take a deep breath in and sip a little more air and out. And with that breath, we don't often slow down to think about the miracle that it is that every breath we take in is the breath that plants have exhaled. And literally, we are surviving off of what plants are giving to us. There's reciprocity there. And now think about the food you last ate. I know a lot of us at that potluck, oh my gosh, y'all can cook. There was squash, there was rice, there was fresh produce. Think about the hands that grew that produce, the water that fed, that watered all those plants to grow that food, the soil that it was growing in. And then think about the water in your water bottles, like, where does that come from? Those of us living here in Fresno, most of our water comes from groundwater that's pumped out. This is water that falls in the winter months and percolates into our aquifers and these recharge basins. And so I just want to emphasize that we are literally composed of air, we're composed of dirt, and we're composed of water that comes from our watershed if we're buying, produce from our watershed, or it comes from other watersheds. So we can't disentangle. We are part of nature, our very bodies are. So through this talk, I want us to kind of reimagine who is our neighbor, who is kin, and who is relative, not in terms of, I think the language of it has allowed the extractive ideas of if a river is an it, we can totally abuse it. We can take all of the water for our own needs without giving anything back. But if a river is more than it, if a river has a right to exist, then we have a different relationship with the river and all the life that is contained within the river. So this drawing, it's a little hard to see here, but is a drawing, an artistic rendering of our watershed from headwaters to valley floor. I'm part of a wild church community here in Fresno, this church experiment, and we commissioned a friend to paint this beautiful drawing of, or painting of our watershed. And there's so much life, there's so much beauty and also brokenness contained in our watershed. And a lot of neighbors, I would say, too. So I want to take a tour through our watershed, starting from the headwaters, and I want to give that tour as if we are, at first we'll be kind of like a raindrop falling at the headwaters or snowflake, and then midway through the tour will turn into salmon as we go downriver. So we're going to start at the very high country. This is a place near and dear to my heart. This is the headwaters of one of the branches of the San Joaquin River. This is Thousand Island Lake on Sierra National Forest land, and you can see these high peaks towering 11,000, 12,000 feet. In the winter months, they're coated with snow. There's glaciers still up there and lots of snow fields. And that snow gradually melts and feeds these beautiful alpine lakes that trickle out into rivers. The San Joaquin River goes through Devil's Postpile National Monument close to Mammoth Lakes, and it plummets over a series of waterfalls. Here's Rainbow Falls. And then it goes into kind of this rugged middle elevation zone, and there's not a lot of trails out there. And honestly, I really want to get out there because it's really hard to get out to, and it's often like kind of too hot in the summer, too cold in winter. You have to time it just right. But these middle elevations are these polished granite domes and coniferous forests. And it's in that zone from like the 1920s to the 60s, there was this big rush to build dams all across the West Coast. And the San Joaquin River was prime area for a lot of these dam building efforts. This is the Kirchhoff Dam. So there's kind of these series of dams that were built on the San Joaquin River in that mid-elevation zone. Here's Mammoth Pools. And then this is Red Eager Lake. And these are just three kind of dams on the main stem. Pretty much every creek flowing into the San Joaquin River was also dammed. There were proposals for dams even in areas that are now Kings Canyon National Park. So if you've been to Evolution Valley, folks up there, they went up there and they're like, wow, there's this beautiful valley full of meadows and wildlife. You know what would be a better use for this? Let's build a dam here. And they saw, I think they had goggles that just turn landscapes into potential reservoirs. And then here is what settlers called Millerton. What do you notice in this picture, or what draws your eye? Anyone? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, a friend, Charlie Onich Carpenter, shared this. He's from a Mono tribe. And yeah, he too, I think when I first saw this, my eye was drawn to the white buildings, and then I kind of didn't see, like you see some cedar structures. In Miwok, those are called umachas. I'm not sure what they are in Mono, but these cedar houses. And this serves as a reminder that pretty much everywhere where reservoirs were built, people have lived for millennia. And for tribes in these areas, they would say they have lived here since time immemorial. Because rivers are where life is, where food is, where there would be villages, ceremonies, sacred sites, burial grounds. And a lot of these were covered up with water. This is in 1940. This is the first blast as they were starting to construct Friesen Dam. which would flood Millerton, which would then become Millerton Lake. I have a nitpicky thing about things called lakes on maps that are actually reservoirs. I think language is important, and I think we ought to call them what they are. They are not lakes, they are man-made reservoirs. And this is the first bucket of concrete for Friesen Dam in 1940. And this was a real death blow to the San Joaquin River. This is what Friesen Dam looks like today. And here's another map or a way of looking at things. The font's really awfully small, but you can see rivers curving as rivers do and flowing. You see Tulare Lake in the middle of the valley, and you see names of indigenous peoples that have lived here, like I said, since time immemorial. And there are different overlapping territories within our valley and within the foothills. And so I think there's a way to tell this story through pictures and through facts, and then there's another way to experience it through poetry. So I wanted to share with you a poem by Deborah Miranda. She's an indigenous poet from the Ohlone people. And so this poem is not about the San Joaquin River in particular, but this is a poem that speaks to what happened in watersheds all over California. And so the poem goes, "My father opens a map of California, traces mountain ranges, rivers, county borders like family bloodlines. Tuolumne, Salinas, Los Angeles, Paso Robles, Ventura, Santa Barbara, Saticoy, Tehachapi, places he was happy or where tragedy greeted him like an old, unpleasant relative. A small blue spot marks Lake Cachuma, created when they dammed the Santa Ynez, flooded a valley, divided my father's boyhood. Days he learned to swim the hard way, and days he walked across the silver scales, swollen bellies of salmon coming back to a river that wasn't there. The government paid those Indians to move away, he says. I don't know where they went. In my father's dream, after the solace of a six-pack, he follows a longing, a deepness. When he comes to the valley drowned by a displaced river, he swims out, floats on his face with eyes open, looks down into lands not drawn on any map. Maybe he sees shadows of a people who are fluid, fluent in dark water, bodies long and glinting with sharp-edged jewelry, mouths still opening, closing on the stories of our home. And I really love this, the image that she paints of a land that, a land under the surface of the water is not drawn on the map. So you see the map of Millerton Lake, it literally erases the topography underneath. So in our map making, we erase the land that is under these reservoirs, under these lakes, and some have said that a map of California highlighting reservoirs is a map outlining theft and erasure of Indian land, because these are often some of the most important areas to tribes in California. The land under the surface of the water is not drawn on the map. And then I wanted to bring in a voice from people from our own watershed. And so this is from a quote from Ron Good from a paper he wrote. And Ron Good is an elder and tribal chairperson with the Western Mono people. He said, "The river," meaning the San Joaquin River, "was our backyard where we played, hunted, fished, speared, swam, panned, gathered, socialized, and held ceremonies and events. My people and family have been coming to Smalley Cove, that's upstream from what is now Friesen Dam, for hundreds of years." Here, the resources, grapes and grapevines, blackberries, sour berries, onions, watercress, milkweed, acorn, wormwood, salt clover, brodea, oak shoots, chaparral, redbud, sedge root, deer, rabbits, quail, doves, pigeons, gray squirrels, trout, steelhead, suckers, salmon, mussels, should I say clams, and huya are rich and abundant. And correction, he's with the North Fork Mono. And so the river was a source of life and abundant life. And I also want to highlight salmon for indigenous peoples aren't just like, it's not just food, it's central to your culture, your religion, your spirituality. And so the death of salmon also was just deeply impactful for indigenous peoples across the West Coast. And I've learned recently too that this is true in Oregon, and I imagine similar here. It's literally in some of the planning of these dams. They talk about the purposes of the dams. You know, it's for flood control, it's for water for agriculture, but they also explicitly outline that they want to kill salmon and with the purpose of removing indigenous peoples from land. And so there was explicit like genocidal impulses in the very like creation of these dams, and it was in writing, in official documents, in dams, with construction of dams in Oregon, and I imagine also here in California. And so we have these maps with the names of people groups and rivers flowing free. And then we have these maps that is our new reality here in California. And so I'm going to zoom in. This is a map that the Friesen Water Authority made. And I think it's very telling of how we view water in our watershed. And so you'll see the boldest, brightest, thickest line. I like making maps, so I think about like, who made this map and what was presumably he thinking? The biggest, boldest line is the canal and the Friesen Current. So the Madera Canal and then the Friesen Current Canal. And that's telling because that's where most of our water goes now. Over in even post, I'll get into some of the river restoration, but upwards of 97% of water from the river no longer flows in the river, but is diverted into these canal systems. So these are the new pipes and the veins that move water in our valley. And I think it's also telling that the actual river outlines are like a more subtle blue, and they're thinner lines, which is representative of their diminishing because of these canal systems. And so this is where, in our watershed, where we start the story of salmon. So at the lower elevations. So picture, you know, Friesen Dam got built. If you're a small fish, there's no way in hell you're going to get over that dam. And so the story of salmon starts just downstream of Friesen now. Historically, salmon would have run up much further into the watershed, even into the high country. Basically, it would go until salmon would swim as far as they couldn't, so it takes a big waterfall. So picture like Yosemite Falls kind of waterfalls. There were probably salmon in Yosemite Valley historically. And so, yeah, in our watershed, they would have swum much further up the river than Friesen. So the story starts, there's just a little egg in the river, and they hatch out of these nests that are called redds in the river. And these tiny fish, they're pretty cute. Their egg yolks are attached to them, those kind of bright orange things. So for the first little stage of their life, they're not eating anything. They're just like turning their egg yolk to their body. It's like transforming, and so you catch them, and they still got their little egg yolk attached to them. And then gradually they emerge from the gravels, so they're like tucked under the gravels, converting their egg yolk into salmon tissue. And then and this all is happening, right? A lot of the only like suitable habitat now is in the Lost Lake area, if you guys have been near there, just downstream of Friesen Dam. Okay, so they emerge from the gravels, and then they're fry. And fry is when they swim to the surface, they fill up their swim bladders with oxygen, and they begin eating food. And they need nice juicy bugs and macroinverts to eat in the river. And this is a really vulnerable life stage because they're about yay big. and there's a lot of bigger fish in the river. So they need places to hide and tuck their small little bodies away. And they can't take big pulses of water from the dam, or else they'll just get flushed downstream. And then they get chunkier, and they develop these parr marks. They're called parr, those like black stripes. And that helps them camouflage and avoid predators. And this is probably my favorite life stage. This is when they start moving downriver, down from Friesen and into the kind of middle area of the San Joaquin River, and this is the smolt phase. And when they smolt, they turn this beautiful like silver color. And I feel like it's a small miracle, the smolt phase. So imagine the changes to their physiology that they undergo when they smolt is like akin to us, our like lungs changing so that we could live on a different planet with like a different atmospheric composition and different pressure. So they're preparing their bodies to transition from fresh water to salt water. And that's a big deal if you're a fish. So so the most radical changes happen in the cells of their gills and their kidneys, where mechanisms for moving fluid completely reverse direction. So they need to get their body ready to, like in fresh water, their insides are saltier, have higher ion concentrations than the fresh water. But when you go to the ocean, the salt water, your external environment, is saltier than your insides. And so if you didn't make adjustments, you'd basically like pickle yourself in the ocean because your osmotic balance would not be right. So they have to, like, their organs make fundamental changes to prepare for ocean life. So that's a smolt phase. And then who knows why? I think it's maybe evolution's like backup plan. Some of them stick around in freshwater for a whole year. Those are called yearlings. So that way it's like if it's a bad year, you got some fish might wait it out. If you have a drought year, you'll have some fish from that round of hatching can make it out the next year. So some guys hang around and get fat in freshwater. Those are the yearlings. And then finally, there's some make it all the way out to the ocean. So they swim to the delta. They physically swim under the Golden Gate Bridge. Like all salmon have to swim under the Golden Gate Bridge. Imagine that, to get out to the ocean. And out in the ocean, oh, it's a good life out in the ocean. There's a lot more food than in freshwater systems. They swim like far out into the Pacific Ocean. They're not just like loitering around Bodega Bay or anything. They're going far out there. And they spend about 3 to 5 years in the ocean. And then something happens, and some sort of cue, a call of nature, I don't know what, and they somehow know, like, it's time to go back home. And they turn around from the ocean, go back under the Golden Gate Bridge, swim up the delta, and they think fish navigate using, like, this sounds a little like, ooh, but they think they navigate using the magnetic field of the Earth, which I think is wild. So they're not using Apple Maps, they're not using Google Maps. They got their own like GPS system in their brains that they're navigating with the magnetic field. And then when they hone in on their home rivers or their natal streams of where they're born, they think they use their olfactory senses, so like their sense of smell, to smell like, that's water coming out of Friesen Dam. I'm going that way. So they're picking up on some chemical cues from the rivers. And the journey back upstream, back up to where they were born, is a really taxing journey. These fish, they're not eating at all as they swim back up the river. They're just, basically the only thing on their brain is like, swim home, reproduce, swim home, reproduce. They're just like one-track mind to get back to where they were born. And when they get there, they're literally like, their bodies are actively decomposing along the way. All the energy is not going into repairing organs. They're like rotting as they're swimming back upstream. And all the energy is just going into reproduction. And when they get there, the females, they like dig out these nests with their tails in the gravel, and they males court the females, and then the females deposit the eggs, and then the males fertilize them as they're getting deposited, and then the fertilized eggs just fall into the gravel bed. And then it's a little sad, the parents die before the babies even hatch. So all that work, and you don't even know, like, is it worth it? I don't know. I don't know what they're thinking, but I think it's take a second to think about how wild this is, that this story works out for these fish, and that they've been doing this for millennia. Like, there have been generations of fish doing this up this river, here, just a stone's throw away from us. And we live in a really special spot, and I want to emphasize this. Historically, 1 million salmon every year used to make this journey. And our river here represents the southernmost salmon run anywhere in North America. And they were genetically distinct salmon run, too. So they were different than any other river. And I think most people picture like your little, you eat salmon, and it's like sort of a small fish. These were like chonker fish. These were like up to 50 pounds of fish would be coming upstream. When they were building Friesen Dam in the 40s, and there was, this judge wrote that before the dam, so many salmon migrated up the San Joaquin River during spawning season that some people who lived near the present site of Friesen Dam compared the noise to a waterfall. Some residents even said that they were kept awake nights by the myriad salmon heard nightly splashing over the sandbars in the river. A fisherman who lived downstream recalls that in the 1940s, the salmon were so thick that we could have pitchforked them. One almost could have walked across the river on the backs of the salmon when they were running. And I want to remind us, too, that a lot of these changes have happened in a mere blink of an eye. My own grandfather, who grew up in Reedley, not far from here, he'd say his dad used to go to the San Joaquin River to go spear salmon, and he remembers that as a kid. So there's generational memories of there being salmon in the river here. But by 1950, salmon were extinct in the river, largely because of diversions from these dams that were built in the canal systems. In most years, there'd be a 60-mile segment of the San Joaquin River that would run dry. And so think about that life cycle of a salmon. You can't exist as a species if you're the middle part of your journey, there's no water. I mean, the math, it doesn't compute. And so after 18 years of litigation, in 2006, there was a settlement, and folks were successful in making the Friesen Water Authority return water to the river. And this was a big, big deal. And so the goal of this lawsuit or settlement was to restore a self-sustaining population of Chinook salmon below Friesen Dam, and then somehow at the same time avoid adverse water supply impacts. And it's taken a long time for this settlement to have some real effects on the ground. Here's a map of what kind of was proposed, and it's complicated and it involves a lot of engineering, so I'll just highlight a few things that this settlement has made possible in restoring water to the river. Here's the East Side Bypass. So this is a small dam or weir that is being dismantled. There's 2 of them in this area. This is around where Mariposa Creek enters the San Joaquin River, kind of closer to Merced. And this is in 2019, and I think in 2021 they're removing structures as kind of mandated by this lawsuit. And then here's another so these are all these small dams that are downstream of Friesen Dam, but still pose barriers for fish getting both out to the ocean and back home to spawn. And so this is Sac Dam. And you can see this is Sac Dam in a big water year. I think this was it was either 17 or 19, but you can see that water is flowing over the dam. So when there's lots of water coming down the rivers, when it's a really wet winter, these dams don't pose much barriers to the fish. Like they could easily get over that. But it's in those low water years when if you're swimming back upstream and you're like an actively decomposing salmon, you're not gonna get over that small barrier. And then here's Mendoza Pool, and that's another one. They're actually re-engineering a whole side passage to go around this structure so that there'll be fish can go on like kind of this side escape route to get around this small dam. And then this is some pictures I took, actually. I worked on the San Joaquin River Restoration Project in 2019 and 2020, and those are two really exciting years for the project because it was the first time in over 65 years where we had fish successfully making their whole journey from the ocean back up the river and then spawning. And I was on the team that was actually catching some of the first fish that had hatched and were going back downstream. And so it's pretty small, but we're under Highway 99 there. We had a fish trap down there. We're kayaking out there in a kind of big flood year to check the fish trap, and that's what those traps look like. They're these rotary screw traps. So we'd be catching the salmon after they spawn, and they're small juvenile salmon swimming out to the ocean, and we were trying to see how many fish were successfully spawning and making their way out of the downstream. And so we'd catch the fish and measure. That's about what they look like. I've measured a lot of small fish. And then we also had adult fish returning back upstream, and they're pretty big. And some of them, like I showed you those small dams that they can't get around, we'd have to go out there to catch them in these big, they're called fyke traps, and literally put them in the back of a truck and then truck them up to around Highway 99 and then release them. And let me just tell you, that's not a great way to like make a self-sustaining population, is having like a handful of biologists like manually finishing your fish journey. Like it's a lot easier. I think everyone will thank us when the fish can just swim the whole way and don't need to go on the highway one by one. So, let's see. Okay. And so I just want to highlight some ways that and ideas of ways that you guys could get connected with the river, with salmon. I know not a lot of you want a low-paying job measuring fish on the San Joaquin River. I'm sure they'll take some of you if you want it, but I know a lot of you have lived in Fresno longer than me, so you probably know this already, but the San Joaquin River Parkway is always looking for volunteers. And I'd encourage folks to think about what are ways that, in these uncertain times of national politics, like what are ways that we can make a difference for our neighbors here in our own watershed? And how do we do this in community? I would encourage you to like think about what are the groups that I'm ready in? How could my small group or Bible study or community group maybe once a month go out to the river and help with a work day? And that it can be a communal thing and a joyful thing to get to know the watershed, to get to know the river and your place in it. Here's a picture of, I think, Lois. There's Lois's daughter, Erica, and my brother-in-law, Santiago. This is Wild Church. We took a canoe trip. We were trying to do this like once a year to get to know the river better, is taking our church out on the river. And that was just a really fun and I think a beautiful way for people to see the river. And some people got in the river, some of them accidentally too. So, and if you're more of a land person, I'm a little more of a land person. I encourage you to walk along the river. There's beautiful spots along the San Joaquin River, and I feel like that in itself is a little act of rebellion. The city planners for Fresno, I feel like there's like intention in like disconnecting people from the natural world. All our canals are straight and concrete, and there are no winding creeks through the city like there used to be historically. And then it's hard in a lot of areas to access the river. So I encourage you to be a little rebellious. You could talk to me afterwards about some of my favorite spots along the river and go out and experience the river on foot. There's my sister, very small, beneath this valley oak tree. So you could get an image of, that tree is probably, I would guess, well over 500 years old, and it's been drinking from the aquifer and the river groundwater system. It grows right next to the river. And so there's a lot of life all along the river too. And then there are ways that we can bring and restoration and some tastes of river life home too. So this is a house me and my sister shared in Fresno when we lived here. And this is what it looked like when we moved in. A very typical, those lines are very straight and that grass is very green. And that looks very nice, maybe if you lived on the East Coast where it rained a lot. And this is what we did to that yard. We transformed our front yard into mostly native plants. It was this beautiful, chaotic explosion of poppies. We planted a valley oak tree. I hope it lives to be as big as that 500-year-old one day. I will be long gone. But there's a valley oak tree, there's deer grass, there's elderberry. And native plants are one kind of, within our area of control, it's one way to express, I feel like, reciprocity with plants and grow in our relationship with plants is knowing how to tend them and how to care for the plants that grow within our watershed. And I feel like gardening has helped me experience that. Oaks harbor a huge variety of biodiversity, of bug life, of bird life, and like the elderberry, there's a species of beetle that lives here in our watershed that only lives off of elderberry, and it needs elderberries to survive. So I feel like it's another little act of rebellion to like tear out your lawns and put back in some of these plants that would have been growing here historically and kind of rewilding Fresno patch by patch and maybe bringing the river and its life closer to home. And with that, I want to just say, like, that's just a small taste, and we live in a rich and beautiful biodiverse watershed, and go where you're led, but I encourage you to go spend some time by the river and experience the neighbors that live just next door. And no need to reinvent the wheel. Here are some organizations that are doing some really great work here in Fresno. And I also want to highlight and encourage folks to find ways to support indigenous groups and tribes that are doing good work to rebuild tribal sovereignty. And because I think we can't disentangle, a lot of us come from settler lineages and have been complicit in the taking of land and resources. And I think it's important that we, as people of faith, offer ways of giving back and returning, trying to help restore right relations in our watershed. And thank you so much, and I'll be around for questions and whatever you guys want to talk about, whether it's salmon or meadows or alpine plants. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Do you all have questions that you all would want to ask at this point? Yes.
You mentioned that salmon have been coming up the San Joaquin River for millennia. Could you be more specific for how many millennia? Do we have a sense for how far back that goes?
Ooh, that's a really great question. Yeah, I'm not super well versed in the literature, but I could get back to you. But I would say they have been around for a very, very long time.
Okay.
I think similar, like a lot of indigenous peoples would say salmon have also been here since time immemorial. So long time, yeah. And maybe, I don't know, Michael, I know you know your deep history of the state, so. Okay, yeah, yeah.
Could you say a few words about the Klamath River restoration, which has occurred, where the dams were taken down? And as I've read, indigenous comments to say that the river has come back to life.
Yeah, no, it is amazing. I really want to, I feel like it would be almost pilgrimage to go up to see the Klamath River. Maybe that's a church idea, do some dam removal pilgrimages. So so if you don't know, in Northern California, there's the Klamath River, and there's a series of dams along the Klamath River. It's like Iron Gate Dam, and I forget the other names, but they were up for relicensing, so it's FERC, I forget what it stands for. Ken, what does it stand for? I don't know, Federal Commission of, yeah. Anyways, all dams, there's a cycle through which all dams have to be relicensed and basically get the federal stamp of approval, like, yes, we want this dam around and we're going to keep it in operation. And so that's a really great window for kind of folks that are proponents of restoration to prioritize, like, what dams are no longer necessary anymore. I think there are some dams that everyone can agree, like, our very civilization as we know it is reliant on some dams existing. But then there are other dams that are actually kind of defunct now, not serving any use, and they're actually more of a liability than a net benefit. So they were able to make that argument with the dams on the Klamath in Northern California, and it was led by indigenous groups up there, as well as other environmentalists to take out these dams, and it's going to be the largest dam removal project in US history, which is really exciting. And if you, I've been up to the Elwha River in Washington. They had a dam removal there in the early 2000s, and it just took like 3 years for salmon to come back. Or it's like a really quick, like, you give these plants, you give these systems, you give these animals a chance and they will return. And it was just beautiful to see what used to be flooded now full of life. So I'm hoping, and from what I've seen from pictures on the Klamath, is they're doing a lot of active restoration, and a lot of it's led by tribes to make sure that when the reservoir recedes, that it's not full of weeds afterwards, but full of good native plants. So, yeah. Oh, back.
So I wanted to ask, are there any like maybe invasive plant species that might, affect the health of the salmon that are, going through the watershed? And I guess the polar opposite of that question, what are some good plants that we have, along the, the water that may help the salmon? So
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think, if you walked along the river, it is a mix of, there are some kind of invasive weedy plants, and then there's some native plants. And a lot of like good salmon habitat requires there to be, like old logs that fall in rivers. And so a lot of our, the river now runs through a lot of agricultural land that is totally like stripped of any native vegetation. So just planting kind of anything along rivers tends to help. And then also thinking about the inputs, so a lot of the pesticide and fertilizer runoff really impacts water quality, which can affect fish. And then I think probably one of the biggest threats in the river, if you're thinking about you're a fish this big, we'd catch a lot of big bass in the river, and those just like gobble up those juicy little salmon. So bass are a big threat as far as water quality, and then just the water temperature itself. If there's not a lot of water in the river, you all have lived through Fresno's hot summers. Picture if a shallow river gets hot a lot quicker than a deeper river is. So that's why it's important there to be not only water in the river, but enough to keep the fish cool enough that they can survive. So it's all these, it's not directly plant related, but yeah, it's all connected. And like, I like the way you're thinking as far as like, it's about overall system health, makes the ecosystem healthier. And there's other things in the river that did you all know that sturgeon used to swim up the San Joaquin River? Like big, big fish so like salmon restoration isn't just about salmon, it's about lots of other animals. We'd catch these lamprey. I should have had a picture of lamprey. If you picture basically like the creepiest alien you could, combined with like a long squiggly worm, eel-like, they have these like googly eyes. But there's two species one is endangered here in the river, and the other is a little more common. But those also, they have kind of the reverse life cycle of salmon, where they lay their eggs in the ocean and then they come up the river. They go from the ocean to the river and then back to the ocean. So there's a lot of species they need there to be connection with the river and the ocean. So it's all kind of tied together. Yeah. I don't know if I fully answered, but yeah, got me thinking.
I'm the least scientific literate person here, I'm sure. But I did read that in regard to the Klamath Project, two things that really interested me. One was that the salmon, the decomposing bodies of salmon, when there's a good salmon run, enrich the plant life.
Yeah.
Along the river, the redwoods were taller when there were salmon runs. And so it's that, nothing is really wasted in nature. And then also the Klamath rituals and culture depended so much on the Chinook salmon. And so there's a meaning to it beyond just the nature cycles.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, which is similar, I was having this conversation at the potluck, but similar ideas of like, scientists have recently discovered that like these isotope analysis of plants in the Pacific Northwest, and they found out that like the nitrogen or kind of the structure of these plants the source is out in the ocean. So it's literally like salmon are like fertilizer, bringing nutrients from the ocean onto land, and their decomposing bodies are like nourishing the forest as they're dying inland. And I'm sure that's something that most indigenous groups would be like, yeah, of course, we don't need a scientific study to talk about the isotopes, but yeah.
So I want to ask this question carefully.
Yeah.
How do we have productive, healthy, constructive conversations with our farmer friends who are really disgruntled about the removal of dams and how much more important it is to feed the nation than to save a fish?
Yeah.
And there's expletives along with the fish.
Yeah.
I really want to have, a healthy, productive relationship, literally with my friends who are farmers, and I just, number one, I'm ignorant about both being a farmer and saving the salmon.
Yeah.
But I feel like being a farmer and being an environmentalist are not so far apart. And so what do you think?
Yeah, I'm curious what you all think too, because I don't pretend to have the answers. I guess one thing, I think the story of even bringing water back to the river here in Fresno, like the goal of this restoration project is not to take out Friesen Dam. That's like explicit, that Friesen Dam, for better or worse, I think is here to stay for our lifetime. I think all dams have some sort of lifetime, but I don't know, everything will, concrete will crumble at some point. The goal for this restoration project is just the reach of river downstream of Friesen. And so the removal of these small dams downstream of Friesen have kind of negligible impacts on the overall water supply. So I think it is a story of like, we can have agriculture in the valley and fish in the river. I think it's the paradigm is like, at most time points, there's about like 3% of the flow, 3% of the San Joaquin's waters, the flow is coming down the river channel. That means 97% of it is going to agriculture. So it seems like in our current paradigm, there doesn't seem to be, I think we can have fish and agriculture. And I'd also like to I know it's so hard because I also, know people and have family connections with agriculture. Like, how do we reimagine what agriculture could look like in the Central Valley, and do we need to be growing as water-intensive crops on such a wide scale in a way that is not, I don't know if the word sustainable is right, but doesn't seem to be giving life to the whole watershed or to the river, or much reciprocity there. But I don't know, that's tricky. But anyone have a thought about that? I want to open it up to you all too. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Lois. Okay.
Sorry about that. Are there any like boat tours that go all the way down all the way out to the ocean? That would is there anything going on like that that could be educational, or you could invite a prominent farmer?
I think we should organize that.
I think you should too. Yes.
I sometimes talked with my Uncle Ken about, I don't know, doing a little kayak tour down. So open invite if anyone wants to boat from Friesen down to Friesen to the Bay, to the Delta. That would be pretty fun.
Yeah, I was going to say I live in Carruthers, which is southwestern Fresno County, close to the bypass for the water from the Tulare Lake to San Joaquin Delta. And most people out there who are farmers don't seem to correlate that rivers run into oceans. Their main concern is that, especially in the wet year 2022, I think, common comment, I hope they don't let any of this water escape into the ocean.
Yeah, and it's a paradigm of any water to the ocean. It almost is like the equivalent of you've left your tap on, or it's wasted water. I think that's where language is important. The river, I think, has a right to exist as a river, but that's a larger, that's philosophical question that we've deemed that the river does not have a right to run, and that the highest use of a river is as a extractive resource to grow ag in the way that we're doing ag in the valley. And I want to also, this is a little of a, I don't know if this is a helpful argument, but having water go out to the delta, you could also, if you want to get into a debate with a farmer, you could pivot to it's important to maintain the health of the delta system, which our decisions here in the valley impact farmers in the delta. So if there's not enough fresh water to keep the salt water at bay in the delta, so there's different, the fresh water keeps the salt water from intruding further into the delta, and so you can't grow rice in the same ways if you have too much saltwater intrusion. And so our farmers' decisions in the valley negatively impact farmers in the delta. So by having water be flushing out of the system into the delta, it's actually helping farmers there and helping prevent saltwater intrusion into aquifers in the delta. So that's maybe another angle to take, yeah.
I'm sure some of you will have more questions, and perhaps you'll be able to catch Rachel afterwards. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you again to our Creation Care team, our outreach chair, Gary Barber here at Willow Avenue, for bringing this tonight. Come back, join us again on December 8th. Laura Roberts will be sharing on the idea of watershed discipleship, trying to tie some of these various pieces together within a specific theological framework as we think about what it would mean to live as people of faith in this particular watershed. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you again to Rachel, and have a good night.